Well, hello everybody. Good evening to those in London, and good morning to people that may be joining from other parts of the world. I'm Sara Pantuliano. I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you online and wherever you are today to the latest iteration of our MDB Leaders Series. And I'm really delighted to welcome tonight Odile Renaud-Basso, the President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Only a few days after the EBRD had its very successful annual meeting in Samarkand. I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the course of tonight's conversation. But importantly, the shareholders of EBRD agreed to an expansion to Sub-Saharan Africa and Iraq. But we look forward to hearing more in just a few minutes. Odile took up the presidency of EBRD in November 2020 and was the first woman to head a multilateral development bank. I'm afraid I regret to say that to date she still is the only woman heading a multilateral development bank. Oh, yes, it's true. Yeah, just. Anyway, not that many, still a lot, a long way to go. Before heading the EBRD, Odile was the Director General at the French Treasury, where she oversaw the development of France's economic policies. And she was leading on European international financial affairs, on trade policies, on financial regulation, and debt management. And in that position, she also served as the Vice President of the European Economic and Financial Committee. She was a deputy to the G7 and G20 groups and the French governor or alternate governor at the World Bank, EBRD, and the African Development Banks. She was also chair of the Paris Club. What an impressive resume, Odile. So tonight's event is really important because we will touch on a very key subject at the core of EBRD's mandate, but also a subject that is one of the most important challenges in the current debate on MDB's reform and the reform of the international financial architecture, which is the mobilization of the private sector. And I just want to put this into context and give you a few figures just to remind ourselves of the scale of the challenge. The IMF estimates that public and private sector together must spend an extra 2.6 trillion every year until 2030 if we are to meet just 5 of the SDGs around education, health, roads, electricity, and water and sanitation. And the independent high-level expert group on climate finance finds that development that is compatible with climate commitments requires emerging economies, other than China, to spend 2.4 trillion annually. I mean, the scale is staggering if you think about these figures. And at ODI, we've done a lot of analysis on what MDBs and DFIs can do to provide more funding. And while it's self-evident that the private sector has an important role to play, the flow of capital, quite frankly, is hindered. It's just not at the level we need it to be. So the question that we're posing tonight is how can MDBs be catalysts for private sector mobilization? And there is no better MDB to discuss this than the EBRD, that was created in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall to assist countries of operation to transition from a state-command economy to a market-based economy with a vibrant private sector. And that remains to date the focus of a lot of what EBRD does. I quote from the website, this commitment remains to furthering progress towards market-oriented economies and the promotion of private and entrepreneurial initiative. So we listen with great interest to Odile's view on this key issue. But we'll then, sort of have a discussion, and we are joined for this discussion to explore the topic further by Manfred Schepers. Manfred is the CEO and founder of ILX Management, and that's an Amsterdam-based development finance asset management company. But Manfred has more than 30 years of experience in both development finance and international capital markets. And you were at EBRD yourself between 2006 and 2016. Manfred was the vice president Chief Financial Officer at the EBRD, where he led on the bank's institutional investment partnership program. After EBRD from 2017 to 2021, Manfred was a member of the Investment Committee of the EU's European Fund for Strategic Investment and currently serves on the supervisory boards of Dutch financial institutions. So we'll have a discussion between Manfred and Odile on how we can really enhance this private sector mobilization, which I will facilitate, and then I'll open it up to the audience, both here in London and online. And our strapline to the eye is Think Change, so I really would like everyone to contribute their thinking on how we can, further change. So please share, your views and comments in the discussion, and do amplify the discussion online. The hashtag for Twitter is MDB Reform. It's Reform MDBs. So please do amplify the conversation online. But without further ado, let me now hand over to Odile.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you for inviting me here today. And I want to pay tribute to Suma, because he was the first one talking to me, and launching this idea. And I think it's a great idea to being two London-based institutions to know each other better, work together, and develop cooperation. I think your mission is more relevant than ever, and it's very interesting. For us to partner with you. And we are living in a challenging world. I think from our perspective, EBRD, we see, two huge challenge and huge issues. The first one is the war in Ukraine and the impact it has, on security in Europe and, globally, food crisis, energy crisis, and also more in depth, the challenge it represents for the shared values of democracy, peace, and so forth, and justice. And the other is climate emergency. And no need to reiterate what it means, what it represents, but I think that for an MDB now, and I will come back to that, climate is of course one of the key challenge, and it's true for, because we need to be able to support developing countries in addressing and getting ready for the challenge. And even if they have limited responsibility in global warming, they are, first of all, very often at the forefront of the impact, but also they need to have policies that help mitigating the evolution. And as this crisis identify, we see polarization, geopolitical tension, and fragmentation. And for multilateral development bank, of course, this is a challenging. It creates challenges per se, and it creates new questions. I think of how can we work, what we should do, and so forth. We are heading towards next year the 80 years of Bretton Woods institution. So of course it's also a time for rethinking and draw think about the future. And I think there is both a clear need to act on climate change to prevent the worst scenario, but also to resume the reduction in poverty, which is, of course, at the core of the mandate of this institution. So, just a few words on what is called, the MDB reform, and what are the key questions from an global, MDB perspective, and then I will focus a bit more on EBRD. But in a way, I think there are three key questions that are that are now raised for MDBs, and in part starting with the World Bank, but I think it's a question relevant for all of us. The first one is the role MDB should have in tackling global public goods and transboundary challenges, and climate change is typically the one of the key strategic public good, but there may be others. And this should be done while maintaining a steady path towards SDG, and we are not there yet, clearly, on SDGs. And I think these are two interdependent objectives: environmental sustainable and a healthy world, or a world without poverty, is very important to achieving lasting prosperity. Second question, which is also, very closely related to the first one, is what should be the role of MDBs in middle-income countries? They have been progressive, in particular in the World Bank. Clearly, it's more focused on the poorest countries, but how to address middle-income countries to help them with global public goods, but also because you have pools of poverty in middle-income countries. And of course, you cannot, support to middle-income countries should not be at the detriment of support for poor. You have a question of allocation of resources, and resources are not unlimited. But I think these are two complementary issues and not zero-sum game. And the third question, and this is, the one we will talk more with Manfred at the end, is what can we do what can MDBs do to mobilize more private sector through our full range of activities? But I will come back to that, because I think that there is no one single answer, but a lot of things we can do in order to facilitate private sector investment and contribute to raise to the challenge. So, and I think there is another, the last question maybe on top of this three key question is, it's not new, but it's still very relevant, is how MDB can work as a system. Because we each of us have our specific mandate, our history, our geographical scope, and so forth, but we very often cooperate, we address common challenges, and there is a lot of things we can leverage working more together, better together, and so forth. So now that this is for the key question, I think, which are on the core of the discussion on the MDB reform, and where is EBRD on this in these different challenges. So first of all, let me just a sort of very short history of the bank, because of our, we were the most recent bank before creation of AIB and New Development Bank. So now we are not the youngest one, but we're still quite young because we were created in '91 at the on the fall of the Iron Curtain, and it was really, the answer. Europe and broader, a large group of shareholders decided to create this bank in order to help the transition of former Soviet Union countries and former communist countries move towards market economies, democracy, and market economies. And that's why I think, because we are younger, we were created at a point where some of these issues of global public goods and so forth were already on the agenda. We have, for example, embodied in our mandate the question of sustainability, sustainable growth, and so forth. And that's why the question of energy efficiency, green transition, and so forth has been quite earlier on in the bank agenda. The second feature, which is very specific to the bank, is this very strong focus on the private sector, because the purpose of the bank was really to develop private sector in these economies and to catalyze on private sector to support development. We have, this target of having 75% of our investment in the private sector, which we continue to stick to, and really, our structure is, but this is true for all MDBs, to use our capital, which is provided by public shareholders, to leverage, to borrow on the market and leverage and expand financing. But the specificity is that our clients are tilted to the private sector. And we are mobilizing, and I will come back to that, private sector alongside our own investment directly and indirectly. And the last feature, which is very specific to EBRD, is the fact that we are, by our geographical scope, historically focused quite on middle-income countries, not so much the poorest countries, but that will change now because of the decision taken in Samarkand, but still the bulk of our countries of operation are middle-income countries. And what we've been learning in our history is starting from this very specific mandate of getting out of Soviet Union in the post-Soviet environment and so forth. we develop tools and priorities and way to invest, and that appear to be very relevant to other places. And that's why the bank geographical scope has progressively expanded to Turkey first, and then to Mediterranean countries in the context of the Arab Spring. And now the latest move is very recent and is still to be implemented, is to move into Sub-Saharan Africa in a limited number of countries to start with, in order to, because, I think the shareholders agreed, and after a lot of work and analysis and so forth, that our specific model and would bring something into the region. Maybe two other specific features which are relevant in terms of when describing the EBRD is, first of all, our model is very much based on having a lot of people on the ground, boots on the ground, as we say. So compared with other MDBs, we have strong teams in the country, which is very important for less advanced countries where you have lack administrative capacity and so forth. And the third, another feature is also, and I will come back to that we combine financing and policy advice in relation with our priorities. So as I was saying, climate has been since the beginning quite a strong priority for us, and we have set as in 2022 we reached two important milestones in that respect. The first one is that we have now all our investment Paris aligned, so we check every project to be sure that it's consistent with reaching the objective of the Paris Agreement. And we have now, in second year in a row, reached 50% of our financing green. So it's a common methodology defined by MDBs, what is green, and 50%, we already have 50% of our investment in that area. And we managed to do that while, on the other hand, making progress on our two other horizontal priorities. So we have three horizontal priorities: green, inclusion, including gender and digitalization. And so we make progress in parallel on these three priorities. So that's where we are. We've been, as I explained a bit how we've been evolving in terms of geographical scope, and the last milestone that represents the expansion in Sub-Saharan Africa. There have been other evolutions in the bank in the way we've been working, and in particular on how we define, how we assess the added value of our project in relation with the transition mandate. So our mandate, as I was saying, was transition, but how do you measure transition and how do you assess it? And there has been quite a big evolution of this concept of transition, moving from something based on three criteria, which was creation, expansion or deepening of market, establishment and strengthening of institution, and the adoption of behavior patterns and skills that have a market perspective. So transition very much focused on market and institution, behavior, and deepening of market, to a new concept of transition defined in 2016 with 6 transition quality, which enlarge a bit the scope of how we measure the impact of what we are doing. And these 6 transition qualities are competitive, well-governed, integration, regional integration, green, inclusive, and resilient. So we look at each and every project and try to measure the impact in relation to these qualities. And for us to be able to support a project, it needs to have at least 2 of these qualities, to have an impact on 2 of these qualities. And this very much drives the selection of projects we are financing, but also the policy advice and the policy component of what we are doing in order to help countries or clients moving forward onto these different qualities. And I think that's something which is very important, and I will come back to that, on the value added of the activity of an MDB, which is not only about providing money and being a bank, which is providing loan, but also supporting, encouraging our clients, both in the public and private sector, to transform themselves in order to be more competitive, more resilient, more green, and it's quite. When I joined the EBRD, I knew, of course, the concept and so on, but I was quite impressed about how we can develop that with the private sector. So taking a client, a bank or a company in industrial, a manufacturing company, and still, bringing them money because they need to do investment, but also convincing them, for example, either to decarbonize or to have a pro-gender program in order to bring more women in the workforce, or developing digitalization, new technologies. So this qualitative element is also a very important dimension of what we bring, both in the public policy agenda and so forth, but also with private sector. So in a way, looking at this short history of EBRD, it shows that, first of all, the bank has not remained static. It has remained true to its mandate and consistent with its mandate, but also in a permanent evolution and trying to address in a more efficient way the challenges of the time, and with widening its geographical scope, but also trying to really address the new challenges. In terms of geographical scope, it was quite also interesting to see that EBRD has been called, in the time of the euro area crisis, has been called to help Greece with the recapitalization of the banking sector, and we've helped them a lot with the green transition also, and Cyprus. So this was short-term assignment. Cyprus will stop already. Greece we will stop in 2 or 3 years, in 2025. And so it's short-term, but, being agile and able to step in, help, and then stop. So that's, I think a bit in the DNA of the bank, this agility, and we try to preserve it despite all the, the requirements which are always increasing in terms of AML, CFT, transparency, and all this. So maybe, now what's next for us, and I will focus then on the conclusion of Samarkand, which was our annual meeting 2 weeks ago. Important one for 2 important decisions. I've already spoken about Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's important to underline that it was a long process in order to get all our shareholders on board, because of course it's not a new continent because we are in the North Africa, but it's a bit further away from Europe. So there were a lot of discussion among shareholders about the role of the different MDBs. You already have African Development Bank and so forth. But I think that at the end of the day, we make the point really that with our business model, and this boots on the ground, focus on the private sector, and bring together policy and investment, we would help growing the pipeline of projects and develop opportunities for investment. The second very important decision for us was directly related to Ukraine, because Ukraine has been for us a top priority since February 2022. Because of the historic, it's an historic country for the bank. We've been the largest institutional investor in the country, and we thought it was very important to continue to support the country in the war situation. So we developed last year a sort of specific business model with continuing to invest in a war, but asking shareholders to provide us with guarantees, risk sharing, in order we take 50% of the risk on our balance sheet and 50% is supported by grants or guarantees. This worked for 2022, 2023, but we think that looking forward and thinking about the fact that we don't know how long the war will be, and we know that there will be huge need for reconstruction. We started to reflect about what is the best way to get shareholder support, and we concluded very clearly that the best way is capital increase, because it has a higher leverage in terms of money. $1 or €1 put in the bank would give 4. If with capital increase, it gives only 2 with risk sharing. And also visibility, predictability, and capacity to scale up in reconstruction. So it's much more efficient for shareholders, and it's much more efficient for us, and it's better for Ukraine. And so it was, we managed, I think, to convince our shareholders that this was the best way forward. And in Samarkand, they agreed, they acknowledged that, and they gave us a mandate to come with a concrete proposal for by the end of the year in order to be able to make a decision. So this is, we still have some work ahead of us, but there is a clear direction that we are heading towards a capital increase, which is very, good news for us, because it will really help us in continuing to support Ukraine in 2024 with different scenarios of war or reconstruction. The last decision which was taken on Samarkand was a direct implementation of the CAF report, so the capital adequacy framework, which was asked by the G20, and it was to an agreement by our shareholders to withdraw from our article of agreement statutory capital ratio, which was a sort of historical, very basic, not risk sensitive ratio, and it will be at a lower level in the board's policy, so can be changed more easily. So I think this is also, preparation for the future will help us and giving more flexibility. So that was for us, it's a big roadmap. We will start investing in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now we need ratification of the Article of Agreement. It will take a bit of time, but we hope to be able to start in 2025. And we hope to have a decision on capital increase by the end of the year. So that will be very important. And all this needs to be done while keeping this question of climate at the top of what we do, because that will be very, very important in Ukraine and very important in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so last part of my remarks will focus on the mobilization and to start, or maybe it's already too long. So maybe I stop and I will talk mobilization in the dialogue. So that's
perfect. Thank you so much, Odile. Well, sounds like Samarkand was a very successful gathering, because obviously it was not just the expansion of Sub-Saharan Africa. We talked about recapitalization for Ukraine and, of course, implementation of the CAF. So a big agenda ahead. But let's move to the private sector mobilization, as we said. And maybe I'll turn to Manfred, because, you were at EBRD for 5 years as CFO, 10 years. Yeah, of course, I've just said that. But 5 years as CFO, right?
10 years. Yeah.
As CFO, right. So what led you to set up ILX Management?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the speaker. And it's nice to do it together with Odile, because, the reason for creating ILX came from my experience at the EBRD. It's an unbelievable training ground. Particularly for somebody like myself who had made a change. I ran capital markets at UBS for more than 10 years, and I felt that it was time for a career switch, and I had the opportunity to become CFO at EBRD. So the two together gave me a very good understanding of what was happening. And I had the sad privilege of being the CFO at the EBRD during the financial crisis. And then we had the Central European crisis, which people have kind of forgotten about. We had the Arab Spring, which was a huge challenge for the EBRD, but it needed to have its resources to be able to do it. The invasion of the Crimea that resulted in the bank having to abandon operations in its biggest country. So all these things, to some extent, landed on your desk, and you had to have a view what was the right thing to do. But the bank did very, very well during that period and was able to respond in the way that Odile is talking now. So when my last 2 years I was there was when in 2000, I did three things. One, we created an equity fund for the bank that gave me a bit of an understanding of how the private investors thought about what the bank did. And the SDGs were articulated in 2015, and we had the Paris Accord. And so those are the last two things that happened, and has transformed everything for everybody, the way the EBRD does business now, but also for in the private sector. What I observed at the time, that was partly from my experience before the EBRD, but also during the time of EBRD and returning to the Netherlands, I participated in the European Fund for Strategic Investments, the Juncker Plan, which was really there to deal with kind of rescuing Europe after the financial crisis. We've all forgotten about these things now, but at the time it was really critical. And that there was a clear market failure, which persists today, and that the banking system is unable to support these huge needs for investment, broadly speaking, within sustainability, but obviously now more climate focused. Similarly, the stock and the bond markets are playing, partially a role. People are excluding certain stocks. Companies and governments are issuing green bonds, which are all helping, but they're not adding the additional risk capacity that is needed to be able to make the investments. Liquidity is abundant. I mean, the central banks, of course, over the past 10 years, basically printed money. They're now tightening, but basically liquidity is not the issue. The issue is risk capacity. And that's why the EBRD now is having a capital increase and things like that. So it was clear that there was a market failure that was not being addressed by the capital market on the one hand and not being addressed by the banking system on the other. And we live with that today. So I thought, in coming back to the Netherlands has a very highly concentrated and developed pension system, similar to Scandinavia. And they had for reasons that the Netherlands, of course, is very emotional about sustainability and climate change, being effectively a country that's very vulnerable to climate change. And so the pension funds already then, when I returned in 2017, had gathered together with the central bank to articulate what they called SDGs, Sustainable Development Indicators, to shape the pension fund around sustainability. And so a lot of talking and very little doing, because it's very hard to do in a financial system that doesn't do. But from my experience at the EBRD, it was clear that this asset class is really an asset class. I mean, Odile, you referred to the fact that you work closely with your sister organizations, but the reality is that is very true, and that is very much an untold story about the commonality of the multilateral development banks. And so I felt that let's try and see if we can create a fund that brings them together, where we will co-finance with all the MDBs on behalf of the Dutch pension funds. And so when I spoke to the German government and the Dutch government and the UK government about the concept, they gave us incubation funding to see if we could unlock it. The marketplace is a data-poor environment. There is no public data on anything that multilateral development banks do. They're very public in their reporting, but in terms of their financial reporting and their sustainability reporting, it's basically a closed shop. And for reasons that are obvious, because their stakeholders are mainly their shareholders and the countries they support, not so much the private sector. They're co-financiers, but not key stakeholders. But so we set out to unlock that, and it took us from 2017 up until January last year to get to the point where we had sufficient data. And all the MDBs helped. We got good syndication data, we got credit data, we participate in the impact harmonized HIPSO. They have a harmonized indicators for private sector operations. Sounds very bureaucratic, but they literally try and map and see if what Odile referred to is they've got a common reporting method for the Paris alignment and climate. It's a huge asset, and we use it. And so with all the data, we were able to build the case for investment, and then we started last year with the three large Dutch pension funds. Dutch pension assets are 1.5 trillion alone, so there's plenty of scope for them to increase their exposure here. And the main value for them is the clear SDG and climate use of proceeds and reporting. We're an SFDR Article 9 fund, not relevant in the UK, sadly, but very relevant in the European Union. And of course, it's very strange that you've got the asset class that looks the most obscure, a private credit emerging market, is effectively the greenest of green funds. And basically because that's what the MDBs do. They are the best impact investors in the world. And so we've started, and we now manage over 1 billion for them. We're a specialized firm, so we're not seeing this as part of our portfolio of asset management products. This is the only thing we do, because we think that this is an asset class that has got huge potential to grow, but it's a very different skill to trading bonds or trading equities or running it as a bank portfolio. This is a skill where your alignment of interest needs to be very close with the MDBs. So the way we run our business is virtually lockstep with the MDBs. We don't need a senior position to the MDBs, so we match their maturities. And similar to the pension funds, those are long liability asset owners. The MDBs are effectively long liability asset owners. And so it's a perfect marriage to bring them together. The banking system is a short liability, long asset. Well, look what happened in California. It all went a bit pear-shaped, and in Zurich, by the way. So this long liability, long asset model, to scale that up is, I think, the big challenge that the MDBs have. But I think we're at the beginning of something very significant there. So that's, and I think what has really been proven over the past, we've now been operational for just over 9 months. We have co-financed with the EBRD, IFC, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, Latin, the Inter-American Development Bank, FMO, very modestly, but we were the largest B lender to the EBRD last year, so larger than all the banks. Still very small, but it just shows you how broken the system is in terms of the commercial banks participating. So in terms of the discussion, I think on the market creation side, there is still a lot more to do in terms of the immense data gap that exists. I mean, you cannot have a scaled up asset class of trillions where there's a data poor environment. That's not the way finance works. So finding data transparency, harmonized reporting, common practices among the MDBs is a real priority. But G20 is focused on it, and I think everybody's on the same wavelength. There's a credit database called GEMS. There's now been a survey to unlock it. So we're all moving in the same direction. But climate change is not something we can, sort of look as a long-term horizon. These things need to happen now if you want to achieve it. There are some issues that also need to rest regarding climate transition. There's a big debate in terms of course, financial systems are getting very conservative on financing energy transition, and the issue about the fossil fuel issue. Well, of course, the energy transition in countries like Indonesia, South Africa, Bangladesh, Vietnam are not going to happen without fossil fuel. So this is a big debate. How do we help them? If we block that door, there is no finance. I mean, to my point, there is no other finance than MDB finance in this country. So if the international community does not enable the transition in these countries, of course, we're kidding ourselves. So this is a big debate about energy transition and who finances it. Because particularly in Europe and in the UK, it's a bit of a no-go area. But of course, in the emerging markets, that's why you see a lot of opposition from emerging markets in all the climate accords, where they say, well, we can agree to everything, but you've got to help us. And the question is, how do we do it? It's not going to come from the commercial banks and not from the stock market. I think I'll stop there. There's a lot of interesting questions to come, right? So I look forward to the.
Yeah, let's get to the questions. Then thanks for explaining what ILX management does. I mean, I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions on the energy transition, but I'll leave that for the audience. I just wanted to try and unpack a little bit more this private sector mobilization. I mean, if I understand correctly, ILX strategy is in many ways dependent on a shift in the MDB model from one of operate to hold to one of operate and distribute. But there are many obstacles there. And so I'd be interested to understand better what the obstacles are, and if that is the right model, how do we get there?
Yeah.
Don't know who wants to start.
Maybe, first of all, I think that today in the green transition, the limiting factor is not necessarily finance. It's not because even if we had trillions available today, in what project investing them, this is a challenge. And I think so, and I don't mean, I think that we see an acceleration and we see more need for financing and so forth. So at some point, finance will become a limiting factor. But today, for example, in the countries in which we work, finding project for the, green project is not so easy, because you need to convince the authorities that this is the right way to go, that this is in their interest. You have a lot of vested interest. You have a lot. So there is a huge work which is needed in order to convince, and to facilitate, to develop investment opportunities in emerging markets. And because you can do small project, but at scale. So and this is a lot of policy work, of economic work, in order to show that it's in the interest of the country, that they have, for the long-term competitiveness, it will be better. That now that the cost of renewable has decreased very substantially, the case is much easier. So that's why we see an acceleration, and the trend is really picking up. But up to now, and you need to have, for example, the right regulatory framework, legislative framework, in order for renewable investment to be able to develop and so forth. So this is a huge part of the work that is needed, and it's very often done by MDBs. I consider this is core of our responsibility to really develop this environmental and this strategic approach that will, in partnership with the government and with our clients, to create investment opportunities that will facilitate green transition. And then when we come to I agree that there is we will need a shift to more originate and distributor share, because one of the limitations is the fact that our business model is to get some revenues based on our lending activity. So we do not, normally we don't have capital increase. We are set up in a way to be able to be sustainable, and the EBRD did not get for years capital increase, because we generated revenues that were put in reserve and allowed us to grow our portfolio. And for that, you need to have margins and to generate revenue. So to be able to do the work of prepare the project and so forth, you need to have the capacity to do that. And so I think that we need to have a balance in the portfolio we sell, we share, and so forth, and what we keep on our balance sheet. I think that as the need and the investment opportunities will grow, I don't think that will be a major obstacle, because then we can prepare a lot of projects, we can keep a small share, but we are still in the phasing up model to in order to find more investment opportunities, and exploring also always to share, to bring different sort of private investor. For example, we've been developing quite a lot the unfunded risk participation, which is not with pension fund, but with the insurers, where they take part of the risk that we take on our balance sheet. So we share with them. They do not provide financing, so it's not financed, not funded, but they cover part of the risk of our portfolio, project by project, and this is also growing. So this is, we look at all avenues, and originate and share will be, I think, something that will grow. It's also a way to bring investors, not necessarily, for example, at the construction phase of infrastructure and so forth, but you can sell the loan or get some refinancing when the project is more secure. The risk is lower because the construction has been done, it's up and running, and then this is something we've also been exploring on some areas.
What's your view on this, Manfred?
Well, yeah, no, I think the main thing is the scale that is required. And if you look at what the MDBs are now doing in private sector finance globally on an annual basis, it is far too low. They're different numbers, but it's something between 30 and 50 billion a year globally across all the institutions. It's a fraction of what private finance is in other places, or what the EIB does in Europe. So that scaling up is really, really urgent. And that will require, on the one hand, capital, but on the other hand, also a business model that enables institutions like ourselves to also scale up. This year, we will invest 500 million. It's our first year. The years after could be up to 1 billion a year, which will make us very large in that market, but still very small. And so facilitating that growth of co-investment is something that I think is really transformed over the past 12 months, but there is a lot more to go. And the other point I think I want to make it perhaps in relation to this question, and it's quite technical, but Odile has been chair of the Paris Club, she fully understands, is the role of international financial institutions as lenders, which is a privileged status because under treaty, the IMF and the World Bank, EBRD, and the other multilateral development have got a unique status in these countries, and that allows them to do so well. That allows them to be such a efficient institution with local presence, etc. And that is something that can be shared and is shared with the private sector like ourselves, and that's something that has a lot more potential to also increase. I think that will facilitate that distribution of not only, basically will facilitate the distribution of those assets, which will provide both risk capital and liquidity.
Let's talk about the potential for private sector investors to co-invest with MDBs, the mobilization of the private sector in a stricter sense. I mean, there's been so much hype about the billions to trillions, and when we look at the figures, that hype has really been, in a way, demystified. I mean, the OECD overall, figures for all the amount mobilized by MDBs and DFIs in 2020, the overall was 51.3 billion. And at ODI in 2019, we actually did a study with a number of DFIs and MDBs, which calculated that for each dollar of MDB or DFI capital, the private sector capital was $0.75. And actually in low-income countries was 0.37. So not much of billion to trillions there. Why is it so difficult to achieve, this lift, this leveraging? I mean, is there something that is not happening, or is private sector, direct private sector mobilization inherently too challenging to achieve?
Well, I think there are two forms of mobilization. One, which I think a lot more can be done, but the MDBs really play a very big role in, is that is helping the private sector invest in these countries as a developer, as an operator, as a real long-term investor. So you've got, particularly in things like the renewable energy sector, the MDBs are being very efficient at helping private sector companies develop this. But that's more the classic way of supporting the private sector make an investment in these countries. I think what you're referring to is, why don't more institutions like banks, asset management, and there we have a real dilemma where these institutions are looking for liquidity in their investments. They're looking for investment grade ratings in their investments, and they're very vocal. The biggest financial investors in the world are the big banks, JP Morgans, the big asset managers, the BlackRocks. They're very vocal. They're saying, we'll do more, but you have to de-risk me. It's like, hold on, that's like a free lunch. I'm speaking very openly here. Yeah, and so we have to move away from engaging with the people who want a free lunch, because subsidies are something that will not be tolerated by the shareholders of these institutions or by donors. It needs to really be catalytic capital and not subsidy. And for that, there are instruments that can be used. But so this applies to the banking system. The banking regulators, of course, are making it virtually impossible to invest in emerging markets. So none of the European banks or American banks or British banks are active in emerging markets anymore. Asset managers need liquidity. So for them, green bonds will work, but not long-term, illiquid, project-based investment. So you're really looking at the pension industry and the sovereign wealth industry, which is not to be poo-pooed, because in aggregate, the developed pension systems and the larger, call it sovereign wealth systems, you're talking in excess of 10 trillion. So that's a vast amount of capital. So it's learning to work with them and coming up with modalities that suit them.
Do you think that is a positive? I mean, I've heard a lot about the challenge, the balance between de-risking and the subsidy, and that's where it seems to get stuck.
I very much agree with what Manfred said, and because very often, these trillions announced by some international banks saying, just guarantee me and I can come. And so this is clearly not the solution, because even, the need to provide guarantees and subsidies, you need to have soft money, and it's very extremely costly. So that's, but maybe, a few additional obstacle. One obstacle is because, for example, we work in some small countries, so it's easy to attract private investors and do some co-financing. And when you have a project of 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, but we do a lot of projects which is 20 million, 30 million when you work in Western Balkans, in Albania, in very small project, because it's not all gigawatt, but it can be 100 megawatt, and it's still relevant. But and this is the cost to bring private investors of the due diligence and so forth. It's not worth it. So that's an obstacle. I think that we need to address. I don't know, packaging and project, bringing the bulk of project together and so forth. So that's a limitation. The second limitation, beyond the issue of the pipeline of project, and to have, which is, in my view, is currently, I think, a key priority. And to do that, we need, some capacity to do policy work and the grant financing and so forth, to be able to convince countries, clients, that this is a way to go quickly and so forth. But there's another limitation, because you have not so many funds like ILX. It's really, you are a big front runner, your unique profile, private sector, you're in the EBRD and so forth. So not so many people understand really and are committed to invest into that. And I think there is one issue, which is you see now more and more savers, people, who are interested in investing in the green. At least in Europe, people are interested in putting their saving in projects that will have a positive effect on climate. I'm not sure that it's such a key driver, and understanding that in climate investment in emerging countries is something which is good for the planet, and a sort of investment thesis where you can, bring support from your clients, your ultimate clients, and so forth. And that's something maybe we need to better reflect, and because it's not the same to invest in green investment in developed countries and in developing countries where the risk is a bit higher, and so I think that's one element which is the first element, that data and transparency on data and more being able to communicate better on what is the risk related to project financed by MDBs, because in a way emerging countries are seen as risky exchange rate, and project financing is risky per se. But when you have an MDB, because of the preferred creditor status, but also because of our deep involvement in the country, and whenever there is an issue, we are able, even on a private sector project, to talk to the authorities, to find a solution, to ensure that finally, there is a way out. This really reduces the degree of risk, but this is not well taken into account. It's not understood by the regulator. It's not taken into account by the regulation, and so forth. So this is something I think we need also to make progress on.
The other thing that I always hear about when talking about private sector mobilization is more use of blended capital. So basically using concessional financing, usually donor raised, blended with MDB's own capital. Do you have successful examples of the uses of blended capital that we can learn from?
We have a project, our MOU with EFSD Plus, which is a form of blended capital in order, and I think the idea is really because we already have this project without blended capital, but to go a bit more on projects which are more risky that ILX could not take without guarantee. And we have done some project, for example, with refinancing of renewable in Egypt, which is not the best rated countries, and we mixed a MIGA guarantee, so political risk insurance, plus we provided liquidity guarantees that the investor will not wait 3 or 4 years for MIGA to decide to pay because of the processes related to MIGA, but we will provide liquidity immediately. But so we did this project together with MIGA. We improved the rating by 6 notches. So we brought in, but this is extremely costly. The amount of guarantee put by MIGA plus our financing, you can do that for 300 million, but you cannot do that for trillions. So it's a good example. It shows that but I'm not sure the scalability is limited, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the pros and cons. What are the advantages? What are
I've been from the beginning quite outspoken that what we need to create is a transparent marketplace that is not influenced by subsidy. And this, I'm an economist trained at LSE, which you know well. Yeah, subsidies are the killer of an efficient market. And so I think development finance as an asset class has absolutely a critical role to play in our society over the coming 2 decades. And for that, we need to create a marketplace for it and not disturb it too much with subsidy. So that was my inherent firm belief in it. But obviously, I think a lot of the shareholders want the MDBs to go to higher risk sectors, higher risk countries, low-income countries, post-war environments such as Ukraine. And the question of middle income is still very prevalent because the MDBs still play a huge role in countries like Turkey and in Central Europe, in Poland. I mean, so the role is not just in the vulnerable countries or in the poor countries. And so where I think there is a role for donors and governments to facilitate investment is to enable also the sharing of risks in those particular areas, such as low-income countries, to give the MDBs more breathing space, more capacity to make investments there. So that's purely to mitigate certain country risk in effectively CCC rated countries. It's to take away some technology risk. Of course, there's a lot of potential in hydrogen, but there's a big investment needed with a big risk. Well, that's dangerous stuff. So that's where I think blending can really help at the project level. Also make it affordable. I mean, a lot of the green technology that is available to European countries, of course, is quite unaffordable in many other countries. And of course, donors play a big role, call it blending, to enable the affordability of technology. If we're basically going to make technology unaffordable in the emerging markets, well, good luck in their energy transition. It's my earlier point. So I think this project level blending, call it financial blending, which we're now looking at with the EBRD and the European Union, or call it project level blending in terms of grant and making investments affordable. I think is the MDBs and the donors are going to play an enormous role in that. I think where donors have learned their lesson now, what we cannot do, we cannot make the whole emerging market suddenly investment grade so everybody can invest. That doesn't work. So at the core, I think mobilization needs to look at which investors really believe in development finance and are willing to take that sub-investment grade risk, but perhaps perceived risk of being too high, but working with the MDBs. And this is what I've phrased it as. I call it the big blend. The MDBs, they have been created. They have privileges, whether or not it's taxation, whether or not it's preferred creditor status, or whether or not it's the fact that their shareholders don't get dividends. It allows their efficiency, and I call it the big blend because that's been paid for by all the shareholders. It's not capitalized, but it's a status that is incredibly valuable, and so that's what I see as a far more efficient way of blending than looking at technologies that I saw in the run-up to the financial crisis, where there was a lot of structured credit, and I would hate to see some of the instruments that helped the financial crisis sort of enter the phase of development finance. I think there's no place for that.
Really, that's what we call indirect mobilization. We have because when we talk about mobilization, there are some very narrow definition where we talk about 1 billion, 2 billion. But then when you look at indirect mobilization, which is a project in which we invest, but which, because we have been there, allows others to come and so forth, then it's 10 times bigger. So that probably the concept which is more relevant, more difficult to define, but more relevant in a way.
I'm just thinking about our development finance team and sort of setting the exam question of the development finance as an asset class. I'll be discussing that with the team. I want to open to the audience, but really in 1 minute each, I cannot close the discussion without sort of touching on the reform of the MDB's agenda that has been discussed at the G20. Where do you think it's going to lead us? What kind of changes will it bring for BRD, but also in particular for the role of the private sector?
So I think there has been quite a useful focus and vivid discussion, and it's good to have this kind of discussion about the efficiency of the capital used and so forth. I think EBRD, we were already, in the context of the financial crisis, already optimized quite a lot our capital utilization. So I think that there are some recommendations were already in place in EBRD since a few years. For other MDBs, this has unlocked some capacity, some additional capacities, a bit in the World Bank. I think the Asian Development Bank, they have, if implementing the report, they will have additional capacity they did not use before. So I think this is and there are some discussion on, issues we will continue to discuss, possibility to have hybrid capital, and so forth, that will remain very relevant. For us, it's not a magic bullet where we can double our investment without capital. So there is some incremental progress in some. There is something which I think we need to make further progress on, which is, and now it's the objective of the G20 new expert group, which is MDB as a system, cooperation among MDBs and so forth. Because when we work together, we can deliver quite a lot. There is one excellent example, which is the way MDBs have cooperated on solar panel. You know that there have been a lot of, shareholders, key shareholders asking to have, to be very selective in supply chain, much more forceful in supply chain discussion on solar panel because of forced labor in Xinjiang and so forth. MDBs have worked really as a team, and at the end of the day, we really managed to push and to change the practice of the clients, of the suppliers, because they realized at some point that non-MDB will finance them. They could not have any project and so forth. So this shows that when being very well aligned and working closely together, we can be quite effective.
Absolutely, and there's a lot more on sort of on risk standards, on sort of bringing together a lot of other elements and criteria that would be really important. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, that it's tangential is my earlier point about this lender of record status of the MDBs as international financial institutions. I see that as a significant opportunity for the MDBs in scaling up with the private sector over the coming decade. Of course, underneath it is what Odile refers to, this call it the systemic harmonization, that the way they are taking decisions on the energy transition, that the board discussions kind of end up in the same place, whether or not you're the EBRD or the African Development Bank. It's a challenge, but I think it will make life a lot easier if the way the boards look at these critical issues is consistent across the MDBs. Because we struggle with it. You get different answers in different places, and it makes it a bit complex. But issues around just the way we see huge advantage. We did a very large Uzbek solar project where the EBRD was involved, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they're all following the same supply chain issues in relation to the solar. So there was a really classic example of how it can work. And we were the only private sector participant in that entire financing. So I think the issues about the financial recommendations, I think, in my being CFO, being on both sides of it, for me, they're like motherhood and apple pie. Yeah, of course, the statutory change at the EBRD was like, you could have done it 10 years ago, but these things are logical. Some need a capital increase, efficient use of SDRs. I mean, there's obvious things that can be done, but the main thing is the philosophy of how do we scale up together. I think I think that message is what G20 is asking for.
Excellent. Let me open to the audience. First of all, the audience here in London, please raise your hand and say who you are if you are associated with any organization. There is a roving mic somewhere. And for those online, do submit your question in the chat boxes under the live stream, and the team will put the questions to me. Gentlemen here at the front, I'll take your four together. A couple of rounds.
Thank you. I'm Lee Bailey from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. The news about the EBRD's potential entry into sub-Saharan African countries is really interesting. I read that a couple of the potential, I know, and I don't want to press you on it because I know it's all very early days, but I read that Ghana, Senegal, Nigeria are among some of the countries that you may look at working in. These countries, I mean, you look at Nigeria, so highly dependent on oil. It's becoming a huge problem there. Ghana, not dependent on oil, but very has a significant oil industry. Senegal looking to enter the natural gas sector. My question is, when you enter countries like that, what is the potential for the EBRD and the private sector in conjunction to help with economic diversification? That's an incredibly important issue in a place like Nigeria. And I wondered if in the bank's history or experience in other quote unquote frontier countries in which it's entered in recent years, there are examples that can show the way for investments on the financing side, but also on the policy advisory side there, and how you can use these modalities to diversify economies in places like that.
I said that the energy transition will be picked up by the audience. Thanks. Lady over there.
Yes, hi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Claudia Keller. I work for the German government, long time on climate finance, and I have 2 questions to Manfred. So we talked a lot about risk sharing between private sector and the MDBs, but my direct question, of course, is why are there not more funds like the ones that you did set up? And especially looking at the peers that you have maybe within Europe, I think Sweden has an alike system with the same size of pensions being managed. So first question in a sense, why is there not more than you? And then second one, which I found particularly interesting in dealing with private finance in the past years, is looking at financial regulation within the EU and looking at the green financial regulation, but also the supervision that is very different of pension funds on European and national level. Is it already designed in a way that would at least not be harming you to invest in emerging markets? Or is there something that could be done on that part so that we do not have unintended consequences when it comes to the mandate that we want to have, and that is investing in the sustainability of the global south?
Thank you very much. Gosh, loads of hands. Vince here at the front, and then I'll come to you. Be quick, please. The mic is there.
Climate projects are sort of economically different from others because of the extreme long-term irreversible nature. And your former chief economist, Nick Stern, amongst others, has argued that you should be applying 0 discount rate, not a free lunch, but not discounting future benefits. Do you adapt your project criteria to reflect the special nature of climate?
Thanks, Vince. Can you introduce yourself for the online audience, please? At the back, behind you.
Hi, I'm Bianca Gutzel. I'm a researcher here at ODI, and I work very closely on the private capital mobilization point. And I have a question on both sides of the development finance system. One, the natural question to me with EBRD expanding to sub-Saharan Africa is, how do you, or what are the challenges to mobilizing institutional investors in those countries? Because a fund like ILX works really well in mobilizing mostly assets in the Netherlands, but there's over 350 billion held in Africa. They don't deal with local currency risk. Maybe they're more well suited. What are the challenges and how can we leverage them? And then the second question, if I can, is picking up on something you mentioned about investing in green, but then pushing that to emerging markets. And in our research, that's been a key point. Here in the UK, fiduciary duties, those few pension funds that get sustainability, look at it locally. They don't look at it globally. And I think Netherlands is a special case. So how can we learn from maybe what the Dutch pension funds have already figured out and be able to make that investment case, that sales pitch to EMDs for EMD SDG investment? Thank you.
And this was the gentleman next to you, and then I'll finish with the lady there. And there was loads online, so I'll come back to Manfred and Odile and then try and get to the online ones.
Hi, my name is Mark Boland. I work for Red Intelligence here in London, mostly focusing on Africa sovereign risks. So my question, I'm also interested in this of how to select these countries, and also now you're going in when a lot of these countries mention, well, Ghana's halfway through a debt restructuring. Senegal, their debt to GDP is up at 70%. And how do you manage those risks? And especially if you want to crowd in private investment. I mean, as you know, the multilaterals are excluded from a debt restructuring. So the more multilateral finance, of course, that bears a risk if there is a debt restructuring in the coming years for the private sector. So thank you.
Thanks. The lady here.
Thank you. Hi, this is Ishita, and I'm currently studying public policy at London School of Economics. So you mentioned in the very start that you are looking at policy-based loans and policy conditionality. So I was curious, like, how has been the response around putting in conditionality, especially around sector reforms to make it further private sector attractive? So, and how are you able to sustain it? If you could give some examples. And the second question is somewhat related to what my professor just mentioned. How do you de-risk projects specifically in climate adaptation, where the risk, especially in vulnerable 20 countries, where the risk is super high, there are hardly any returns or revenue streams, especially in coastal projects? Yeah.
Wow. Did you want to start? Take what you like. And then we'll let Manfred deal with the rest.
So on SSA, so first of all, we don't. I will take the question maybe not in the order, the historical order. So we don't do policy-based loans. So we don't do budget policy-based loans. So we do, but we indeed do some. We do some policy which are not related to financing sometimes. When we think, for example, to take an example, we do a lot of policy work on supporting countries to develop an auction framework for renewable, because and this is, and then later on we may have project because they will do auction and there will be some developers in renewable. But so the first part is really policy, just advice in a way, and some when it's related to a loan conditionality, as you mentioned. We try to convince the clients that it's in their interest, and very often, it's the case. Sometimes it's always a discussion. Sometimes they consider, well, it's not interesting for us. So, but it's often we manage to bring them so that it will improve their own management, their competitiveness, and so forth. Adaptation, we do very little. For us, it's a big challenge, financing of adaptation, and that's something because we were not in Sub-Saharan Africa yet. So this is an area where probably we do more adaptation. We do a bit, but because we have this strong private sector focus, it's very difficult to have, economic model for adaptation financing in the private sector. So this is something we want to scale up, and we are working with others in order to learn how we can enhance our financing there, but it's a bit of a challenge. On SSA, so we will not, on SSA in oil countries and so forth, we do not finance oil and fossil fuel upstream and so forth. And in terms of diversification, we will, one of our big priority in all countries is to, for example, support SMEs. So develop through advisory activity, even not financing, but really helping them to formalize and so forth. So it's not, but step by step, develop SMEs and financing through the financial institution, support FDI coming in the country. So all this kind of activity is for us a way to diversify. So and in terms of example, that's what we, for example, Western Balkans, we've been doing a lot of that in Serbia, for example, to develop, to attract foreign investors and so forth. But it's, and sometimes it's a challenge and to diversify. We've been working in Kazakhstan for years, so they are still very dependent because often it's such attractive. It's provides so much resources that it's difficult. But this is something we really, working through the SMEs and FDI is on the question of interest rate, we still, in order to measure the benefit of a project, we still look at the return because of the project. We need to be paid back, so we look at the return of investment and the capacity to pay us back. But of course, we have such a strong priority on green financing that and the way we measure the impact of this project is, I mean, as soon as the project is green, it has a huge boost in our own way to measure the impact. So in a way, this is, I think, the way we address your question. On challenge on SSA mobilization, I mean, private sector mobilization, it will be, I think it will be a challenge. I was talking about smaller countries. It's quite interesting to see with the first project we have had with ILX is related to the largest countries we have, Uzbekistan, Turkey. That's where you have big projects. And as I was saying, for example, I mean, early advanced transition countries, so countries which are less advanced, it's more difficult, smaller project, and SSA, it will be, I mean, that will be a challenge, I think, because the small countries, smaller project, that's where we will have to be innovative, I think, in terms of putting projects together. And the question of debt restructuring, we work mainly with the private sector, so it's not, I mean, you were talking about debt sustainability, government debt sustainability, so we work mainly with the private sector and sub-sovereign municipalities, which are not, I mean, should be without sovereign guarantees. So we will look at, I mean, the solvency of our clients, and this will limit our capacity. We still do a bit of sovereign, and this will limit our capacity to do sovereign financing if the country is really on the verge of, I mean, debt sustainability, major concern. But otherwise, I mean, we believe financial institution, direct private clients, and so forth will be our key target.
Thanks. Manfred, there were some straight for you, like, why aren't more funds like ILX? So that was interesting.
A couple of points that are related to some of the questions. The first on your issue of the carbon intensive countries and investment there. I think the interesting thing in working from outside with the Dutch pension funds, but I think it's going to be very similar in Scandinavia and to some extent other developed countries, where they have from the same policies, very simple, because of course they tend to be very close to their governments, and their governments are very important shareholders of the MDB. So guess what? The policies are very similar. Yeah? So we can't do upstream oil and gas either. There is the question about how do you deal with companies, particularly in emerging markets, that we have a solar project with, or a wind project, but the sponsor is of course also running the fossil fuel plant, and that's a discussion that even in the MDBs is still taking place. How do we deal with these kind of sponsors? In most of our country's operation, the biggest developers of renewable energy are funded entirely out of effect at the shareholder level by very large oil producing countries, in the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, etc. So we have this dilemma everywhere. From a project standpoint, the first project we did as ILX last summer was with a very good bank in Nigeria that of course has lots of business in the oil industry, but we did a woman in business loan for them. So the use of proceeds only went to female entrepreneurs in Nigeria. Yeah? So, and our investor accepted that. They said, okay, we know the bank, of course, is active in the oil industry. How can you not be in Nigeria? But the use of proceeds went directly there. And the questions on why aren't other investors doing this? I think partially it is a bit of a system change in that the asset management industry, the private credit industry, the private equity industry has a very high rent as an intermediary, has a very high cost base as an intermediary. And of course, we're dealing here with pension funds that are very long liability, long asset. They just want to have a sustainable return. It's different to the sustainable return of the EBRD, but not so different. The conditionality around investment is very similar. They have to meet pension solvency, which is a different calculation than the return on capital of the EBRD, but not so dissimilar. So it's finding a like-minded intermediary who can work with those type of things. That hasn't really happened until now, because the asset management industry is looking for different models, part of a portfolio of different instruments. So I think the specialization will come, and we would welcome other people doing it. But it's just not the same as doing a classic asset management business in London. It doesn't. That's why we're in Amsterdam. Most of the employees used to work at the EBRD, the FMO, etc. I'm not going to go into the details, but you're not going to find a lot of similarity between the London financial system and ILX. You'll find a lot more similarity between the EBRD and ILX, and that's part of being in the business. It's part of a new way of doing finance without the cost of the intermediation. The other part is we're relying entirely on the documentation of the MDBs. So we're doing the whole of ILX now with 20 people. We're going to be fully invested this year. We're launching the second fund, which will be 2 to 3 billion, because that's where we see the pipeline. We're not going to do it with more people. We'll do it with 20 people. So it's creating an efficient model that allows a form of intermediation to be done that's different from what the past is. So what kind of lessons we learned, to your question, why don't UK investors do this? I mean, a lot of them are kind of stuck in the old model, and the advisors are as well. The pension advisors are stuck with the old model of advising people to invest in conventional assets. But it's beginning to change, and we'll see it with our successor fund. And conversations like this, I mean, it does wake people up. The point on local assets, I think, is a really important one. And I think Odile didn't touch upon it either, but there is, of course, an elephant in the room, is that a lot of the finance that the MDBs have provided over the past 50 years, we've been selling hard currency liabilities, which is not necessarily the right thing for these countries. But the problem is that there aren't local financial systems that enable the MDBs to efficiently be the provider of long-term local currency risk or local currency financing. So this is a huge strategic objective for the MDBs, to increase their ability to lend in local currency in these countries, because this you can't dollarize the whole of Africa and eurorize the whole of whatever Central Asia. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. But that's an intergenerational type work. So for the moment, hard currency play a big role, also for us, because our investors, they understand dollars and euros. You go local currency, they like it and they do it already, but doing it via this type of instrument will take a bit of education and time. But it's I think really important. And of course, once that begins, you can begin to unlock local savings, because you do have countries in the emerging markets with big pension savings. Kenya, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, so in Asia in particular. And that's something where I think the MDBs have a lot of learning to do themselves. I think for the EBRD going into sub-Saharan Africa will be a big learning exercise in terms of how do you operate truly local rather than just importing or exporting hard currency loans, which is a bit of an easy thing to do. And the last point on adaptation, to reiterate what Odile said, that obviously the biggest challenge in climate adaptation is at the government level. I'm a board member of a Dutch bank that supports the water infrastructure in the Netherlands. That's all. Building dikes and dams in the Netherlands that's not a private sector operation. That's that's public finance. But nevertheless, we did finance a fish farm in Turkey. That most of the sea bass you eat in Amsterdam comes from there, which we can say is good or bad. But anyway, people eat sea bass. And a lot of it comes from Turkey, and it was for an investment because they need to move from but they need to go to the Black Sea for climate reasons. So there was a climate adaptation to the private sector. So you can sometimes find them, but they're not very easy to find. Most of it's in the public sector.
Thanks, Manfred. We got 4 minutes left. I just want to pick 2 questions from the online audience. There were plenty more, but let me just do one each. I'll start with you, Manfred. There is one that is directed to you. It's Chris, no affiliation given. What yields do your investors receive, and over what maturity ranges, and in what credit rating? So say these conversations change minds, so people are really interested.
So as I said earlier, we match the maturities of the MDB, so we can participate in up to 20-year renewable energy projects. Of course, It's not like a bond. So a lot of people think they're 20-year bonds. No, they're not. They start repaying very quickly after they're being constructed. So there's a big sort of repayment period on these projects. The average life is not 20 years. Now it's getting very technical. And from a risk standpoint, the pension funds, I think comes earlier, do have a tolerance to take sub-investment grade risk. The purpose why a pension fund is being created to take risk in a responsible manner according to their solvency requirements. But they're being created to take risk. They take equity risk very significantly. And they also can take credit. So we can invest down to B- sovereign rating. To go lower, that's why we've got the partnership with the EBRD and the EU regarding the EBRD country operation, but we can replicate that with the other MDBs as well to be able to go to low-income countries and more vulnerable countries if there is pipeline there.
Great. And Odile, one last question to you from Sam, also no affiliation given. Sustainable energy projects are indeed more risky in emerging markets than in OECD countries, but the return is often similar. How can we mobilize much larger resources without pushing the yields up and no subsidies?
First of all, I mean, as I was saying, I think the first thing is really to have plans in countries to scale up. And we've quoted the example of Uzbekistan. In Uzbekistan, the country has really decided, they are very dependent on fossil fuel, but they have really decided to move on and increase the level of investment in renewable. And then it creates, I mean, there is no problem to finance it. I mean, everybody wants to invest there to finance this gigawatt of renewable. And we are trying to do the same in Egypt, where they have, we convinced them to develop 10 gigawatts of projects, reduce fossil fuel production capacity, gas power plant, in order to be able to sell gas and get foreign exchange revenues. And then you have 10 gigawatts of project in Egypt. I'm sure we will find investors interested in doing that because the size is there and so forth. So I think this policy priorities is absolutely key, and then we need to have more ILX.
That seems to be the conclusion of our evening's discussion. Well, thank you so much, Odile and Manfred. I definitely leave, more positive, more encouraged, particularly with the innovation that you're bringing to this. We may finally see, more private capital really, mobilized. Maybe not quite the trillions that we've heard about for a long time, but definitely.
One question we didn't answer is, can we have them accept zero discount rates? But we'll work towards it.
Yes, that's true. I think we can leave that for the drinks and nibbles that we're going to have next door with the London audience. For the rest of you who are online, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We will have the recording online over the next couple of days, as is usually the custom at ODI. The appointment for the next iteration of our MDB Leaders Series is for the 20th of June. We will have the president of the Asian Development Bank, Masa Asakawa, same time at 6 p.m. in the evening, but we'll send more information in due course. But thank you very much for joining us tonight, and please join me in thanking Manfred and Odile.